The Vengeance of the Witchfinder by John Bellairs and Brad Strickland. Chapter 7. In the days that followed, Lewis shook off some of the melancholy that had descended on him. He and Jonathan took a ferry across the English Channel and then a train to Paris. There they saw all the sights, the Louvre Museum, the Champs-Élysées, and the Eiffel Tower, among other things. They ate at sidewalk cafes and stopped on the left bank of the Seine to watch art students dabbing away at landscapes. They shopped in more out-of-the-way little stores, and Jonathan showed off his French, which was barely adequate to order a meal or to ask, "How much is this, please?" However, even with all the touristy distractions, Lewis did not neglect his promise to keep in touch with Bertie. On the morning of their arrival in Paris, Lewis immediately sent a picture postcard off to him. Then, on the last day of their stay at the French capital, Lewis received a card from Bertie. Bertie's mother had beautifully clear old-fashioned handwriting. The message was, "Dear Lewis, thanks ever so much for the wonderful card. I hope you and your uncle's holiday is lots of fun. I'll be glad to see you back here again in August. Your friend, Bertie." Lewis sighed in relief, began to feel a little better. The very first thing he had noticed was in the message was the code "Wonderful." At least their system was working and everything was calm and normal back at Barneveld Manor, so far. Lewis and Jonathan continued their journey. They left Paris for Marseille, a French seaport on the Mediterranean Sea, and from there they traveled to Rome with its Vatican City. Then they continued down the coast of Italy to Naples, where the great volcano Vesuvius sent plumes of vapor into the blue Italian sky. Lewis was fascinated by Pompeii, which had once been a Roman city. The volcano had erupted violently in AD 79, and a rain of volcanic ash had buried Pompeii, petrifying everything, just as it had been on that last terrible day. It was spooky to walk in the dead streets and think about the crowds of panic-stricken Romans fleeing from the wrath of Vesuvius. It made Lewis very jumpy. What if the mountain should blow its top again? Then in 2,000 years, people might come to see Lewis and his uncle turned to stone in the streets of Pompeii. A fossilized Jonathan would still be holding his stone Kodak up to take a picture, and a fossilized Lewis would pose smiling in front of an ancient Roman temple. Just thinking about it gave Lewis the creeps. But the volcano slumbered on, and the two travelers continued their vacation. At every stop, Lewis sent a flurry of brightly colored picture postcards. Most of them went back to New Zebedee, to Rosarita and Mrs. Zimmerman. Lewis shopped conscientiously for these, trying to find cards that were appropriate. For Rosarita, he chose cards with pictures of castles and cannon and armor, and for Mrs. Zimmerman, he looked for cards showing lots of purple flowers. But any postcard would do for Bertie, although Lewis tried to find pictures that Mrs. Goodring could easily describe to him. Lewis sent cards to Bertie practically every other day. Meanwhile, 2 more cards came from Bertie, each one containing a code word to signify that life continued untroubled at the manor. As the trip went on, Lewis not only began to feel a little easier in his mind, he also began to feel better physically. Every day he and Jonathan walked for miles to see the sights. In many of the countries they visited, the food proved strange and unpalatable, at least to Lewis's taste. He did not understand how the French could relish snails or the Germans blood-red sausages oozing oil onto a bed of pungent sauerkraut. Even when the food was delicious, like the wonderful Italian pasta, Lewis had surprisingly little appetite. All the fascinating new sights distracted him. So, for once, everything around him was more interesting than food. As a result, Lewis did not eat nearly as heartily as he always had back home. It was in Italy, while they were touring Venice, that he first noticed the resulting change. He was getting dressed one morning when, for some reason, his belt felt funny. He looked down. Ordinarily, he fastened the belt in the very first hole. The leather had a groove worn in it where the buckle clamped it down. This morning, the belt was too loose when he fastened it in that hole. Lewis tightened it. The belt fastened in the next hole, snugly but comfortably. His waist had shrunk by about an inch. Lewis blinked. He remembered the insulting names the boys at school were always calling him: Blimp, Tubby, and Lardass. A long time ago, one of the boys, Tarby, had called him a fatso and sneered. "Why don't you lose some weight?" And Lewis had tried, but without any success. Once he'd even sent off for a Charles Atlas bodybuilding book, but the exercises were boring and he kept at them for only a few days. He had just about resigned himself to being fat all his life. Now, Without even consciously trying, he had lost some weight, and when he thought about it, he never felt really hungry. Louis grinned. Oh boy, he thought, if I could just keep this up, won't Rosarita and Mrs. Zimmerman be surprised? Fortunately, the routine proved easy to continue. At every stop, Jonathan insisted on walking from site to site, climbing miles of stairs in museums and cathedrals and monuments, and sampling the local cuisine. As their trip took them from Venice to Vienna, and then up to Germany, and then up into Germany, Louis tightened his belt a second notch. He seemed to have more stamina, too, and his legs stopped aching as he became accustomed to all the walking. Louis noticed that Jonathan was also losing weight. His uncle had a pot belly that swelled his red vest out. But all the walking they did began to make that shrink. Maybe the vacation would be good for both of them, Louis thought. However, Louis had to admit that one thing threatened to spoil all the fun he was having. It did not happen often, maybe once a week. It was a terrible dream. In the dream, Louis was lost in a brushy field. A few leafless trees grew here and there, and everywhere else the dead yellow grass stood knee-high. Strange bushes poked up through the grass. The bushes had red, writhing, worm-like branches and twigs, and the leaves on them were the same crimson color as blood. In the dream, it was always the same kind of day, overcast and dark. And Louis always had the uneasy notion that he had to get somewhere very fast, but he did not know where he was supposed to go or what he had to do when he arrived. Worse, with the sky so gloomy and the sun hidden from view, he could not even judge directions. So he stayed in the center of the field, while a feeling of dread grew stronger and stronger. Finally, he could stand it no more, and he began to walk. The tough yellow grass snared his ankles and threatened to trip him. The bushes began to stir and rustle, and though Louis could feel no breeze, then he could see that the bushes were straining to reach out and grab him. They wanted to wrap those horrible red tentacle-like branches around his arms and legs. In the dream, Louis started to run. He could hardly drag his feet. It was like running through molasses or like trying to run with concrete blocks strapped to both feet. And he heard a horrible sound of thick breathing, as if some monstrous giant lay hidden just out of his sight. The humid air smelled moldy and rank, and the smell of decaying plants and slimy earthworms and damp dirt. Somehow, one of the awful bushes suddenly sprang up right in front of him. He tried to stop, but the waving grass felt like the ocean pounding against his legs. It swept him forward inch by inch, and as it pushed him closer, he saw something dreadful. At the base of the bush sat a human skeleton, and red shoots of the bush grew through its ribs, caressing them, clamping them, and holding the skeleton in position. The skull looked down on the ribs. As the grass shoved Louis forward, the skull slowly rose. The bush was growing as Louis watched, like plants he had seen in a stop-motion movie film. The fleshless skull tipped back and back until he could see the face. Green glass spectacles covered the eye sockets. "Bertie!" screamed Louis, only his voice came out as a whisper that ripped his throat. The skull's jaw dropped open. It appeared to laugh silently at him. And then the glasses moved. Red twigs grew out of the eye sockets, waving and squirming like handfuls of worms. The horrible writhing shoots pushed the glasses off. The spectacles dropped to the ground, and now Louis was so close that the branches began to wrap around his arms, drawing him closer to the hungry bush. The leaves had saw-toothed edges, and Louis felt a million of them begin to cut into his face and hands and arms, and then he would wake up, shivering and covered with a clammy sweat. On the nights when he had the fearful dream, Louis would lie awake afterward, silently reciting all the prayers he could remember. The next night he would be afraid to go to bed, and he would lie awake for a long time, fearful of what sleep might bring. Luckily, he never had the dream 2 nights in a row. Still, it would return to haunt him again a week or so later. The last time he had the nightmare was the final night that he and Jonathan were staying in Göttingen. After the nightmare had jerked him awake, Louis did not sleep again all that night. He got up the next morning, shaky and wretched from the strain. He fumbled with his clothing so much that Jonathan asked, "Are you feeling sick or something?" in a worried tone. Louis shook his head. "I guess I've been too excited to sleep well," he mumbled. Jonathan said he could understand that, but he kept looking at Louis with evident concern. As they came down to breakfast in the hotel restaurant, Louis and Jonathan paused at the front desk. The clerk at the desk brightened when she saw them. Some mail for the young man. Brightened when he saw them. Some mail for the young man, he said. In heavily accented English, he gave Louis a postcard. Louis recognized Mrs. Goodring's handwriting at once. The card bore an airmail stamp and was postmarked the day before yesterday. The message, written on the front, made Louis's heart thump painfully. It was just one sentence. Dear Louis, I'm awfully glad you are coming back to Barneveld Manor soon. Your friend Bertie. Awfully was one of the code words. Something was wrong at Barneveld Manor, and today Jonathan and Louis would leave Germany and to return to England. Louis had the panicky feeling that all his nightmares were about to come true. And that's the end of Chapter 7.